Welcome to Musical Minds and Missions, M Cubed. I'm your host, Sarah Cahill. M Cubed is brought to you by Phenotypic Recordings, a media company that brings to light new music by world-class musicians and innovative composers, with a focus on music that highlights the most important issues facing the world in our time. Today, I'm joined by pianist Steven Prutsman, also creative director of Phenotypic Recordings, and violinist Owen Dalby, violist Lesley Robertson, and cellist Christopher Costanza. It's wonderful to be with you. We're going to talk about two albums you made for Phenotypic Recordings, the Korngold Piano Quintet and an album of two Haydn quartets. But first, I want to ask you about the St. Lawrence String Quartet. These were the last recordings of your group before the death of violinist Geoff Nuttall, who died of pancreatic cancer in 2022. Lesley, you met Geoff when you were teenagers and you played Haydn together soon afterwards. Can you describe what he was like when you first met as teenagers and how you started to play together?
Oh, sure. Let's see. We first crossed paths as teenagers, as you mentioned, in Canada, a National Youth Orchestra summer music camp, and then later played together in Banff for the first time and playing chamber music. Geoff never changed his whole life. He was bigger than his personality, bigger than anyone else I've ever known. His energy was more dynamic. He had a way of just seizing life by the ears. He loved music. Even at that age, he used to get into trouble. He used to be chastised for moving too much in orchestra. They kept telling him to sit still, move back, don't be so expressive. So that was all Geoff, and is something that he carried with him and embodied his connection to music his whole life.
Yeah. How did you decide to start a string quartet together?
We had played together in the four original folks had all played together in different arrangements over the years. And we'd all spoken, one day, wouldn't it be great to start a string quartet? I was in graduate school. Our original cellist, Marina Hoover, was just finishing up graduate school. Geoff and Barry, who were very close friends, had gone to university together and were looking at graduate programs and had received some funding support from a wonderful organization in Ontario. And they thought, what can we do? Let's just try. Let's start this quartet. So they found support from the University of Toronto and the Royal Conservatory of Music. Geoff phoned me in the spring of 1989 and said, let's do this. Let's form a quartet. And I was far too invested in my graduate studies. So I was like, oh, it's not a good time. And, it's a testament to Geoff's influence in being able to pull people into his ideas that a month later I packed up a U-Haul and was driving north from New York stopped at Yale and picked up Marina. September, we were in Toronto in the sub-basement of the Royal Conservatory rehearsing for 8 hours a day and somehow managing not to kill each other during that first 10 months.
Yeah, amazing. Incredible that you played Haydn early on and then you played Haydn for your last recording together.
Opus 20 number 2 was the first quartet we played together. And so it has a kind of a Haydn definitely defined all the reaches of our time together. And it's a great lens to see Geoff's artistry, his growth as a human, and the life of the St. Lawrence. It's always very meaningful to us. As lifelong quartet, not even enthusiasts, but, when quartet is your life's blood, Haydn truly is the core of that existence, the repertoire and the voyage and the lessons we learn from that writing that we can apply but certainly to everything played after that and explored.
Oh, and you joined the quartet in 2015. What drew you to being part of this particular group?
Well, I was just 30, and Lesley mentioned this idea of quartet as a life's work, and that is a thing that truly sits for me in the core of my musical self as well. By the time I turned 30, I thought that ship had sailed, because you look at the great quartets and, well, they tend to form when you're young and slightly stupider than 30, where you're not having to pay as much in rent or support kids or whatever. I mean, the economics of string quartet are really interesting, namely hard. And so by the time I'd started a couple of quartets, really wanted to do it, and for one reason or another, they fizzled out in my graduate school and early professional days. And so there's that. It's the thing I had always wanted to do, but thought I would never at that point be able to do on a full-time, regular basis. And so I was living in New York at the time, and the St. Lawrence Quartet also happened to be my heroes. As a quartet nerd teenager, I listened on repeat to the early Schumann and Tchaikovsky recordings that they made in the 90s. It was like, if you're a quartet geek, it was like being asked to join the Beatles. It was so huge for me. I remember the voicemail I got from Geoff, because actually, I remember my wife and I had just gotten married. We had bought an apartment in Brooklyn. I remember the date we closed because a week later, Geoff called me, and that kind of set into motion my joining the group. We only ever lived in that apartment for about 8 months while I commuted from New York to San Francisco to rehearse with the group. It was really a dream come true. It was also a homecoming for me because I grew up in the Bay Area. I was born and raised in Berkeley. I don't think that the guys knew that at the time, but it was an extra special thing for me to be able to move home as well as join one of my all-time dream groups.
Yeah, and also you had already done a lot of work with new music, working with composers, and so probably the idea of joining a string quartet who had commissioned John Adams and Osvaldo Golijov and other important composers was probably also meaningful to you.
Definitely. The eclecticism that was the hallmark of the St. Lawrence's kind of musical core was super aligned with my tastes. You mentioned that those composers who were some of my absolute favorites, and in the case of John, knew personally as Ski Trip Dad. And we also, of course, know Sam. And so it was sort of a family connection there. But also, what got Geoff up in the morning was Haydn. And, Lesley pointed that out. And it's clear in the bookends of the quartets, and not just bookends. I mean, he was a constant throughout my time in the quartet and before. Haydn, Beethoven, Dvorak, not so much Brahms. We might get to that. The taste of in the repertoire and the canonic connection that Geoff and the quartet felt, that was really what spoke to me as well.
Yeah. Chris, you joined as cellist, and I wonder how joining the St. Lawrence String Quartet influenced your own musical life, which was already so varied.
That's right. The St. Lawrence was actually my third professional string quartet. So when I was still an undergraduate doing the conservatory, I won the Young Concert Artist auditions, and I was I think I was 21 years old, and sort of got going with, I hate to use the word professional because, professional and music, sort of, obviously they go together, but we like to think of the reality of doing music as something we do because we're so passionate about it and can't separate ourselves from it. And then if we happen to make a living doing it, it's a bonus. My initial foray into the world of touring and playing concerts was as a soloist, recitals, concertos, that sort of thing. But I had always been active playing chamber music. In fact, in doing the conservatory, I had a piano trio. We played together for 3 years, same three of us, and we played a lot of concerts. We had a lot of coachings. We were very active. So in many respects, my earliest chamber music of note was playing piano trios. But also while in school, I did play some string quartets, and I always loved playing in string quartets. When I was in my mid-20s, for a year, I played in the Harrington String Quartet in Amarillo, Texas. I think the group still exists. It was a group that was organized through an endowment from Don and Sybil Harrington, who were had oil money, but they gave a lot to the arts. In fact, Sybil Harrington, for a long time, was the single largest donor to the Metropolitan Opera and would fund a complete production every year at the Met. But she was passionate about classical music and endowed the string quartet. So I played in that group. I mean, that's a part of the world that's very isolated, as you probably know, West Texas, and it felt sort of odd to be there. After a year, my wife got a job in Virginia. We moved back east. I did not play in a professional group for many years after that until I joined a group called the Chicago String Quartet in, Chicago, and part of the Chicago Chamber of Musicians, which was a mixed ensemble of various instruments, and we were pretty active. The Chicago Quartet was a new group. Unlike what Owen was saying, and what Lesley was saying, groups starting when they were young, the Chicago Quartet was started by 4 guys in their 40s, basically. And I was the youngest member of the group when I joined. I joined the second year of the group. The cellist left. Interestingly, went back to be principal of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And I joined, stayed there for 7 years or so until I got the call from Barry Schiffman saying, would you like to audition with us? St. Lawrence Quartet was a lot different from any of my other experiences in terms of excitement, energy, focus, passion. It really clicked for me. It was sort of three's a charm in the quartet world for me. And a lot of things clicked about it. First of all, we were playing over 100 concerts a year at that time. And I just jumped right in and started standard repertoire. Maybe I knew, but, Canadian composers and Osvaldo Golihov and all these other pieces, brand new to me. So yeah, I just got rolling with that pretty fast and was sort of swept up in it. Also moving to California, being part of the Stanford community, all of that was a new world, but a very exciting one for me.
Right.
And so it was quite a change of perspective and energy.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. One of the albums you recorded together for Phenotypic Recordings is the piano quintet by Erich Wolfgang Korngold, a fascinating composer. He was a child prodigy, wrote great film scores, including The Seahawk and The Adventures of Robin Hood in the 1930s. But before that, he wrote this astonishing piano quintet when he was 24 years old in 1921. And you performed this many times together before recording it. Steven Prutsman, tell me about how Korngold writes for piano and strings and your own relationship to this piano quintet.
Wow. Well, first off, I think for all non-pianists out there, this is one of the most challenging, just to get around the keyboard, the acrobatics, the technical challenges, one of the most challenging works of chamber music out there. It takes a lot of practice because it's just incredibly complicated. A lot of folks like to say the stuff like, think Strauss on steroids or something like that. It's just over the top. So that certainly is a challenge. But getting underneath that, what I tend to discover is just this pure love of these new harmonic innovations that happened around that time, that Strauss was pivotal in creating, and what Korngold picked up on, and then many composers afterwards just fell in love with. A lot of Korngold's harmonic modulations you'll hear in the great film scores of today that keep being used and reused and evolve as they go along. I fell in love with this piece before I pitched it to the St. Lawrence, basically. It was a work that Dan played before, and it's not, as well known in chamber music circles as Brahms and Schumann. And, there's a considerable investment every new band takes when they start to study and practice a piece of new music, right? So you have to kind of know that, well, it's going to be worth my time and sweat. After, I recall a fair amount of prodding, everybody jumped on and said, okay, we'll do it. They set a date to play it, and then we have to pick it up and go. And it turned out to be one of the most joyous experiences that we all had once we could learn the notes, because it's not just hard for piano, it's hard for everybody. Owen can attest to that first fiddle part. And then once everybody fell in love with it, then it was kind of the go-to piece. If a presenter would be open for something new-ish, it's so colorful. It's almost psychedelic in a lot of the harmonic movement. And then you'd have one climax after another, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you kind of feel the mushroom cloud explode around everyone. And then it settles in, and we come back to this very loving, dreamy, sensuous times, colorful, kind of gorgeous endings. I'm thinking of the slow movement in particular that builds into incredible climax and comes back with this extraordinary tune that still haunts me to this day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to hear just the last part of the second movement. This is a set of variations based on a song that Korngold had composed a few years earlier called Moon, You Rise Again. So let's listen to it.
We just heard the ending of the second movement of Korngold's Piano Quintet in a recording with the St. Lawrence String Quartet and pianist Steven Prutsman on Phenotypic Recordings. And I'm talking to members of the St. Lawrence String Quartet and Steven Prutsman today. Owen Dalby, tell me what it's like. I mean, it's such an unusual kind of musical language that we just heard. And the ending of that second movement, like Steve was saying, the sort of climax upon climax. And I would imagine that's challenging to go somewhere and then you're going somewhere else and then you're going somewhere else. And it's just not an ordinary sort of musical progression. So is that challenging in that way?
Yes, I would say so. The challenge is, well, there's lots of challenges, but as Steve alluded to, it's getting the notes under your fingers in the first place. And this was a real special skill of Geoff's and Steve's, of course, who was our most regular pianistic collaborator. Every passing musical moment would be invested with 150% of its potential. Sometimes, Geoff would say, okay, we need to help this composer out a little bit. Let's give it a little more juice than maybe is required or suggested in terms of the notation on the page. In the case of Korngold, he is so specific. Every passing moment has a word or 10 of German above it that specifically dictates or suggests how it ought to be played or communicated. First of all, there's this tendency in our group, I think, to really go for it. And that, Geoff's energy was always so pivotal in that. He never phoned it in. And even when he was hurting and towards the end, he gave absolutely his complete all to every performance. And I think you can hear that in this recording. You're sort of white-knuckling it as a collaborator with Geoff, but also in this music where there's all of this instruction and exhortation to do more, to be more, to find places in your musical expressive self that you didn't know you had. That's enormously challenging and exhausting, but cathartic. And once you do it, you're left a sort of shell of yourself, but you also kind of look back and think, well, it could have been no other way, or I wouldn't have traded that experience for anything. That, in a sort of nutshell, was what it was like to play with Geoff. And I think this performance that was captured on disc really speaks to that and is one of the reasons I'm really proud of it.
Steve, you've performed with many string quartets, so tell me what was particularly special about working with the St. Lawrence String Quartet on this Korngold Quintet.
Well, I think it's just what Owen said. They may say this about me as well, for better or for worse. With the St. Lawrence and Geoff, you never knew what you were going to get. It was always going to be a surprise, and there was never a performance I felt any kind of disappointment, precisely because of what Owen said. The intention behind Geoff's playing was to give it your all to the audience, to convey, to kind of squeeze every drop of musicality out of every single interval that happened along the way. Some intervals, maybe there was a bigger kind of squeeze, or the sense that this was an arrival point, of course. But, with Geoff, it was all about intervals, this going from this note to the next note. And that's where the music lied, within the notes. And he was constantly seeking. One of the amazing parts of St. Lawrence that I've constantly relaying to young quartets is that it would be typical that they would travel to a new town and maybe arrive around 10 after a long drive, getting up early the previous morning. And they'd go to the hall and they'd start rehearsing. And Geoff was one that never wanted to stop rehearsing. He wanted to go from 10 all the way to showtime and throw on his, beat up old funky 70s outfit that he just bought from Goodwill the day before and just jump on stage and do it all over again. And that it's kind of a tiring experience to rehearse all day and then perform. But the band would do it, you know, all you cats there, Lesley and Owen and Chris, you know, you just stay up there and keep working and keep discovering. And it was almost as if the act of discovering new musical truths, something like Sunrise Quartet that they may have played hundreds and hundreds of times before, there's yet another performance, maybe in a little museum in Iowa somewhere, they'd still get together and talk about it some more. You know, they would say, hey, what's going on in this bar over here? Wow, there's a little dot here. And it wasn't because they were trying to be scholastic or, you know, prove a point or anything. It was out of pure curiosity that, wow, there's a line there. Well, let's talk about it. Or there's a phrase here. What a dynamic marking that I didn't, you know, I missed. And out of that act of devotion to this, and it comes from a place of pure love. Out of that act of discussing and trying out, they would reach a new musical truth. And out of that truth, you know, that could be incorporated into performance. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But that's what sets them apart. That pure love and curiosity as to what's inside this piece, even if they've performed it many times before.
Yeah. Lesley, I want to ask you about making these recordings at Bing Concert Hall at Stanford, at these two recordings of Korngold and Haydn. And Geoff was already sick when you were making these recordings. Steve was just talking about his work ethic, and Owen too, and how much you rehearsed as a group. Tell me about being in the recording situation and what that was like with Geoff and the quartet and Steve all together.
Well, it's the wheels for this project were set in motion before we really knew that Geoff was ill, before he knew he was ill. There was a time in which it was very much on the back burner. We didn't really think about it. I don't know that any of us thought, oh, will we do it? Will we not do it? It just lingered there. And then there was a moment where we all questioned each other. Should we do these recordings? And I do remember Geoff saying, of course, why wouldn't we? Of course we're doing them. So it just right back into, you know, plan A. During the actual sessions themselves, there was, you know, you might think there was this like curtain of like sadness over everything, but there was more like a great celebration and this gratitude of being able to be together and just the beauty of being together. Yeah, it was really moving.
I think one of the things is that, this is Steve, I just wanted to reiterate that when he was sick, you could tell he was physically really uncomfortable. Sitting on the chair and his gut hurt like hell, and then it would be time for take 25 of the same 4-bar phrase or whatever, and he would pull himself up. You could actually see it physically. He'd be hunched over, and then our you know, wonderful producer, Mark Wiltshire, would say, okay, let's try it. Let's take 25. And Geoff would physically pull his back up straight, take a deep breath, and say, let's go. You know, have this kind of all of a sudden regenerative quality that he'd have. And I think, you know, once he was playing, once that music was coming out of his fiddle and he was inside of it, he forgot that he was sick almost. Music was the eternal escape for Geoff from the woes of the flesh. And I think in these Haydn quartets that you actually hear, I mean, when I listen to you know, again, not to get on a spiritual path, because I don't think Geoff would have appreciated that, but the idea, though, that somehow the musical line would take him to another place, and he would be at peace and happy and singing and all these great qualities that, or making jokes, as Lesley alluded to. You know, he even in a hospital bed, he would find a way to make a joke about something that happened on the TV screen with the third baseman for the Toronto Blue Jays. You know, he was a big sports fan, so that he was able to find that reclusive, special little heaven inside of himself to go to when he needed to.
Chris, do you have particular memories of recording these albums?
Yeah, it's amazing what Steve was saying about Geoff being ill during these sessions. And the irony is, you would think if you were gathering with a group of people and one of the people in the group is uncomfortable, you'd want to buoy up that person. And it was sometimes the opposite. Geoff was the one saying, let's do it. Come on, guys, let's do it. Now, I think he was energizing himself at the same time, but he was so committed and so excited about the project. And speaking of Geoff and recording, I think it's important to mention how much he hated the recording process. I mean, he really didn't like recording. If you compare our recorded output to a lot of quartets that have been as active as we were, there's a lot of repertoire that we just never recorded that we probably could have, and that other groups in the same position would have recorded. I think a lot of that was partially because Geoff was in particular passionate about certain composers like Haydn and got very excited about Korngold because of Steve, I would say. But also because he just didn't necessarily feel comfortable in the recording space. I think recordings we made in Bing Concert Hall, first the Opus 20s several years ago, and then especially these, he found a comfort zone. I think part of it was the circumstances. We were in a comfortable space, a concert hall with a beautiful natural acoustic. We worked with a producer who we loved, Mark Wilshire, who was working remotely from London. The team in place made him feel comfortable, and I think he found his voice in the recording session. And when he found his voice in the recording studio and in the sessions, he played at least as well as he did in concert. That is saying a lot, because concerts are unique experiences, and it's often hard to replicate that. And I feel like in these sessions in particular, he was really finding that place. In some of the takes of Haydn's we did, we would always do full takes of movements, but I dare say there are some of the movements where relatively few edits were even made because his voice was so strong. And then, of course, we were part of that, because a quartet is not about one person. That any way you look at it, it's still going to be first violin forward. And because of his passion for Haydn, we were pulled into that as well. So was it inspiration, I would say, overall, to be in those sessions and to have achieved what we achieved, and to have done it, I think, efficiently. I mean, with focus and intensity and energy.
Let's turn to Haydn right now and his Sunrise Quartet, Opus 76, number 4. We're going to listen to the opening of the first movement. And Lesley, I want to ask you about this piece, because Steve pointed out that the St. Lawrence String Quartet played this quartet many, many, many times in all kinds of different places, all kinds of different concert halls. The opening of Sunrise is truly one of the most magnificent moments in Western musical creation. I think one can say, or I'll say it, that it's truly an exploration. All the Steve spoke about, intervals and how the message of the music is in between the notes, and how that was really our focus, finding out, and just true gift is it in finding those, the expression within the notes. And this opening just allowed, it's like over time for us, maybe it's like a yardstick in maturing artistry, deepening investigations and revelations. Towards the end of his life, this captured him at the absolute height of his willingness to just be indulgent, but not to the point of being sentimental, but to really go deep into where this passage takes one. He's so investigatory in the opening. I've called it his calling card, like his epitaph, he left for us. It's representational of a lifetime of exploration on the one hand, and the other hand, just like a very mature, wise presentation of this magnificent opening. So it's really moving presentation, I think. That was part of the opening movement of Haydn's Sunrise Quartet, Opus 76, number 4. And Owen, I want to ask you about playing these great quartets, which are so iconic. When you think about all the great string quartets through time who have played these Haydn quartets, how do you come up with something new and fresh?
I think it's not just important, it's everything. It's the reason we continue to venerate and offer this art form to a public audience today. You have this amazing stuff that's written down that is a template for creation and recreation and recreation. The fact that we can continue to go back to this source time and again and find new things. We're talking a lot about Geoff, and rightly so, but he was like a kid in a candy store with Haydn. His love for it only deepened as he got older and more experienced. The more he played it, the more there was to play. He was so curious about others' interpretations. I'm thinking specifically of Quatuor Mosaïque, the historically informed gut string quartet that Geoff absolutely adored. We would trade recordings back and forth, old recordings by the new music string quartet from the 50s or the early Juilliard quartet, or these old guys who also shared that spirit of discovery and newness about Haydn. That really excited me and Geoff and this quartet, and I think is the basis for why we continue to play this music for anybody, for ourselves, for the public, why we record it, a deeply important impetus to find what's new in something that is very, very old.
Lesley, I want to ask you about the decision to disband the quartet after Geoff's death, and why you as a quartet the 3 surviving members didn't decide to keep going with another violinist.
What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But I may say that there are quartets that continue to exist as a name, and the name only, the umbrella stays the same and becomes, the personnel changes and it becomes one thing. And then there's quartets that one member leaves and everything falls apart. I think, without getting into our own personal thoughts about how we came to these enormous life decisions, I think they're just different ideas of what is a quartet. I mean, personally, I feel like a quartet is like an entity in some ways. I mean, well, it's almost sacred in a way. You know, there's an energy, there's something unexplainable that happens amongst the chemistry that brings out, you know, you could have 4 of the most spectacular instrumentalists, performers, artists come together, and maybe it wouldn't somehow mesh, wouldn't necessarily have the magic of a really terrific quartet. Or you could have 4 who were, you know, less spectacular instrumentalists who somehow come together, and it's just like, whoa. So there's a chemistry that's there. There's an alliance. There's personal connection there. And that's only the thing that can happen from the inside out rather than the outside in. And that's a journey and a decision we came together.
Yeah. Steve was talking earlier about Geoff's love of baseball teams. And when my husband talks about all the trading that goes on, I just want to say, like, what if string quartets did that? But yeah, it's fascinating. Chris, anything you want to add to the decision about the group?
Yeah, as Lesley said, it took quite some time to come to that conclusion. So many friends and colleagues said Geoff was unbelievable. He'd be hard to replace, but quartets go on and really need to find somebody new. What you've done as a quartet has been so magnificent. I think a lot of it is just at a certain point, you wake up one day and you say, that probably wouldn't feel right. And personally, I mean, I think to myself, okay, for me, it was I joined 22 years ago or 21 years ago. Of course, didn't have a full 21 years in the quartet because we haven't been playing for a little while, but the quartet had a 34-year lifespan, all told. And you think to yourself, I mean, there's no formula for that. You think of the Amadeus Quartet, and I believe it was their violist who very suddenly died, and they immediately stopped playing together. They never had any personnel changes. We, of course, did have some, but there's obviously no rule about that. I often say, and I don't mean this in any negative way, that the Juilliard Quartet, for example, where there have been a lot of personnel changes over, what is it now? If we came back in the year 3018, there would still be a Juilliard Quartet. And I think, one can do that. The group wants to stay alive and you find a way to do it. I think other groups, you get to this place where you say, we've done what we've done. We have other projects we want to pursue, and maybe it's a natural time to sort of be satisfied with what we had. You see groups like the Emerson having a celebratory final season, and I'm sad that couldn't have happened for us, that we couldn't have made the call that way, that the reason that we have basically closed down is the reason that it is. It's a very sad reason. And yet it's for music, for all of us, for Geoff, even though he's not physically here with us, life goes on in a way. The music lives on because of him. I'm glad we recorded what we recorded. I mentioned earlier, we could have recorded more maybe, but I'm really proud of what we did in terms of recording. I'm glad we have a legacy. I think, the time marches on, and I think it just feels like a natural place to be right now. But it did take quite a bit of time to get to that point.
Well, yeah, wonderful recordings, Korngold and Haydn, and very meaningful. Chris, we're going to end with the minuet from Haydn's Sunrise Quartet. And you suggested this movement. I want to ask you why.
Well, Haydn was sort of the master of the minuet. Sometimes he called them scherzi, actually, in Opus 33, for example. But minuet, the lively sort of dance-inspired movement in so many pieces. And if nobody did minuets better than Haydn in terms of surprise and energy and the magic of it. Geoff in particular would say, basically, if you want to know everything there is to know about Haydn in music, listen to his minuets. Go through the quartets and focus on the minuets, even in the symphonies too, same thing, but quartets in particular. So minuets are kind of a key to understanding music, and Haydn's in particular.
Well, let's listen to it on Phenotypic Recordings. And Owen, Lesley, Chris, and Steve, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to M Cubed from Phenotypic Recordings, co-founded by Michael Hostetler and Steven Prutsman. The music you heard on today's show is available on Bandcamp and wherever music is streamed. There are links in the show notes. Today's program was produced by AJ Machado, and I'm your host, Sarah Cahill. Please follow or subscribe so you know whenever we post a new show. You can reach us at info@phenotypicrecordings.com, and we're always glad to hear from you.